Good afternoon. I want to welcome all of you to Hamlin Park Presbyterian Church. We are thrilled to have Clarice come and speak to you. If you don't know, she and I are high school friends, and there are
25.
Yeah, 25 years ago we graduated. We have many of our classmates here today. We have some guests from Temple Beth Shalom also, and we're just thrilled to have you here. I think you will find this presentation worthwhile. We are also live streaming it. So if you have people that weren't able to be here today but would like to see it, we can let you know how they can get onto our website and look at the presentation online. Without any further ado, I introduce to you Clarice Wilsey.
Hi. It's really nice to be here, and I hope you don't mind. I'm going to sit. Even though I'm only 25, sometimes sitting is better than standing for a long time. It's not going to be that long, so don't worry. I'm really excited to be here, and I just want to thank Sandy for inviting me. I want to thank my Lewis and Clark friends from the class of 2026. In fact, this all came about at our high school reunion, which was last August. So I've been really looking forward to this. I am going to be talking about my father's experience as a medical liberator at Dachau concentration camp during World War II. He was locked in with 26 other physicians to give compassionate medical care to the survivors of Dachau. And I'm going to be sharing with you some of the letters that I found after my parents died and we were closing out the family home. And I'll be telling you about that. I'm going to read some of the letters before I actually tell you the surprise about how I found them. And I want to start by just saying and acknowledging that today is Yom HaShoah, which is a very important commemoration of the Jewish people who were murdered, perished in the Holocaust. And at the end of my talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Yom HaShoah. And I'm going to also have Brad from the Temple Beth Shalom give a brief explanation about a program that's going to be tonight at Temple Beth Shalom, and I'm going to be there. And Carla Pepperzak, who is going to be the main speaker, or the only speaker? Okay. Carla Pepperzak, you may know, for those of you who live in Spokane, the middle school way south of here is named after her. And Carla and I are in the same Speakers Bureau for the Holocaust Center for Humanity in Seattle. I'm also on the Speakers Bureau for the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. So I've been part of both Speakers Bureau. I also am in the process of having my own networking in terms of speaking about the Holocaust. This is one example because of my contacts with Sandy. So I want to start out with the fact that I'm going to be talking about mystery, surprise, Nazis, and courage. And those are going to be explained as I go through my talk. I also want to start with a poem, a portion of a poem from Maya Angelou called Bearing Witness that I think is very profound, and I really speak of this particularly when I talk to students in middle school and high school. And at this point, I've probably given about 200 talks to middle school, high schools, museums, libraries, churches, synagogues, community groups, etc. So I'm going to put a shameless plug in. And if you know of an organization or a church or something that you're affiliated with that you think might want to hear me talk, or you have, say, an adult child who's a teacher, or you have a grandchild that might be in 8th grade on up, I would be more than happy to give you my information, and I can either come in person or I can Zoom or what have you. Okay, that's my shameless announcement. Okay, so here we go with Maya Angelou. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. but with courage, it will not be lived again. And so when I speak to people, I want to talk about courage of how we can make a difference in our world. Just one individual can make a huge difference. And when I talk to students, I say, you don't have to go 10,000 miles away to make a difference. You can make a difference in your home, your neighborhood, your Girl Scout troop, your Boy Scout troop, your church group, your youth group. I mean, you name it. And so I really believe in encouraging anybody, particularly young people when I'm speaking to them, to think about what can they do that would show courage and make a difference for people. So my father was one of 27 physicians that went into Dachau concentration camp at Liberation. So I want to give you a little bit of vocabulary lesson here, because I'm going to actually read my dad's letters the way he wrote them, because I don't want to alter what he wrote. Now, obviously, it's not my father's voice, but I knew my dad for 50 years, so I think I can kind of display. Oh, by the way, can you all hear in the back? Okay, Ginger? Okay. So when he talks about Emily, that's his wife, my mother, after the war, when he talks about the 116th, or the 116th Evacuation Hospital, or the evac, those are all the same thing. He was part of the 116th Evacuation Hospital. And they are the group of physicians and surgical techs, et cetera, who went into Dachau at Liberation. And keep in mind, they had no clue what they were walking into. No clue. And I could tell you so many stories. Well, story is not the right word. I could tell you so many explanations of the horror that they saw, that they had no clue that they were experiencing. And yet the physicians were there for over 5 weeks locked in. Why locked in? They were trying to contain the typhus, typhoid, and TB. We all know what COVID was like. So those are very virulent diseases, and they had all 3 of them. So they were trying to mitigate the illness within the population that they could, and also they wanted to prevent those diseases from going out into the community and spreading. And you can well imagine that the prisoners, as liberated, they wanted to get out of there. They wanted to go home. They wanted to figure out where their house was, where their family was, where their, everything. But the chances of them spreading the disease, typhus, typhoid, TB, was so prevalent that one of the big jobs that my father had, because he spoke German, he learned it in high school, college, and medical school. He was not German, but he was fluent in German, and he was the only medical person there that knew German. So one of his jobs was to try and explain to the former prisoners that they were good doctors. They were not evil doctors. And if you know much about the Holocaust, you know that the doctors back then, the Nazi doctors, were really, really evil. So my dad had a really hard job to trying to convince them that they were good doctors. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the victims, the Jewish people, and a variety of people that were there that Hitler deemed awful, that were prisoners at Dachau. I'm going to be talking about the perpetrators, the Nazis, and I'm going to be talking about the liberators. Now, there's been millions of words written by historians, survivors, academics, military, my father, all sorts of people about what happened during that war and the experiences that they had and the impact that had on them as a human being. There's a concept called, you've all heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress. There's also a concept called moral injury. Now, moral injury is something that's newer, maybe in the last, I learned about it about 10 years ago. And it's an expansion of post-traumatic stress. And basically what it is there's two parts to it. One part is that even though the commander-in-chief or the colonel or whatever, general, said, go and kill the enemy, that was against their morals and their values. Because we've all grown up in a society, whether we're religious or not, our society says, thou shalt not kill. We go to prison if we kill. It's really bad if we kill. But then they have to go and they have to kind of swallow that belief in order to fight the enemy. The other part, which I think really fit more with my dad, was when you observe something that is against your morals. My father, when I grew up, talked about being a Hippocratic doctor. And the Hippocratic oath, the first line is, first do no harm. Well, guess what? He was watching and observing and trying to mitigate the horror that he saw and experienced and tried to bring healing to the people that were really close to death. Another thing that I thought was very profound, and I learned this by the son-in-law of my father's best friend at the father-in-law's funeral. And he said that my dad said to him, no man should have to decide who lives and who dies. So my father was in a situation where he had to determine if that person was so close to death that surgery, anesthesia, penicillin, etc., was not going to heal them. So they had to provide a compassionate death for that person. So they did what they could to give a caring, compassionate death. And that was on the part of the physicians, the nurses, the surgical techs, because the people had been through such hell, pardon me for saying that word in a church, but they had been through such hell that they wanted their last breath to be compassionate and to be caring. So the title of my talk is Letters from Duchau. Pretty obvious. A journey of words so rarely spoken. Now, what does that mean? Well, growing up, I knew nothing about my father's experience. So those of you who were at LC with me, or Sacagawea, or Hutton grade school, I didn't know nothing about this. And I'm going to be telling you about that. So after my parents died, and we were clearing out the family home, and this is part of where I'm going to tell you the surprise, but I'm not going to tell you about the surprise yet. Anyway, I found almost 300 letters. Well, I like to refer to it as an emotional earthquake, because when I found those letters and I started reading them, my best description is an emotional earthquake. I mean, it just, yeah. So the journey of words were the letters, rarely spoken, because he did not talk at all about Duchau growing up. We knew that he was in World War II. There was a trunk in the attic that said Captain David Wilsey, MD, 116th Evacuation Hospital. But guess what? It was locked. Well, as children, we wanted to see what was in the trunk. Well, guess what? No, you're not going to see the trunk. No, it's locked. No, you can't go in it. Well, eventually we tried, and eventually being the... Okay, we'll see if I can do this. Okay, so I just want to show you a picture. On the left is my dad and me. I'm about 4 years old there. And on the right is my mom, my dad, my little sister Sharon, my brother Terry, and then I'm sitting on my dad's lap. So why am I going to show you this? Well, when I was 6 years old, we had moved from one house in Spokane to another, and I was in the dining room, and there were all these boxes. And so I was trying to help. Well, I was probably told to help, but I was helping. Okay. I opened up this box, and there were these absolutely horrible pictures of dead bodies, piles of dead bodies. And I'm sorry to give you these horrible examples, but it's the truth. They were pictures that now you might have seen in a museum, in a textbook. if you were watching Ken Burns' show about World War II, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I'm 6 years old, and I see these pictures. Well, what does a 6-year-old do? She asks her dad, what are these pictures? Well, he grabbed them out of my hand. The look on his face, I still see it in my brain, back in my 6-year-old part of my brain. And he grabbed them out of my hand and he said, little girl shouldn't see these. And he takes off, and I'm sitting there on the dining room floor going, what just happened? Well, I knew two things. One, not to say anything to him again, not to say anything to my mother, and certainly not to mention it to my little sister or my older brother. So again, it was in the back of my 6-year-old brain, and it was there until we started moving out of the house 56 years later. Okay, so many of you know about the Battle of the Bulge. It was the bloodiest battle of World War II. And my father was one of the physicians in the Battle of the Bulge. And I'd like to show you an example of why he got the Bronze Star. Now, we didn't know he got a Bronze Star. And when I found it, it was like there was this like puffy thing underneath a piece of like brown paper sack that had been cut out. And it was puffy, and I'm like, ooh, what's in there? And I very carefully opened it, and this is what I'm going to show you. This is why he got, whoops. I'm not really good with all these apparati. Okay. He did 5,000 anesthesias in the Battle of the Bulge. And this is what he did, and this is what that document said about him and why he got why he got the Bronze Star. Operating table, operating table, operating table, operating table, operating table, operating table, operating table. 7 times. The operating tables were in the spoke of a wheel. He stood in the center where all the heads were. And he went around and he did 7 anesthesias at a time. He had to monitor 7 people. Now, I'm going to guess some of you have had surgery. I've had surgery. Well, I'm here to tell you, I don't want to have 6 other people having anesthesia while I'm having surgery. And I'm not going to ask who's had surgery, but I bet you none of you would agree that having 6 other people is a good idea. I met one of his partners, and his partner said, well, I could only do 1 at a time, let alone 7. But you know what? He never told us. And as you can see, the Bronze Star is kind of disheveled. I mean, it wasn't like he took good care of it. And had I not found it hidden somewhere in that box or the trunk. So a couple other things I wanted to tell you about assignment to the front. Now, that picture kind of looks like an operating room, the big light, and people are there, and they're having their instruments. Well, a couple things that are really interesting about surgery in World War II. First of all, doctors were not allowed to carry guns. So when they went into Dachau, they were at the back of the Rainbow Division, which was the infantry, which was part of General Patton's Third Army. It was called the 116th Rainbow Division. I'm sorry, the Rainbow Division. He was in the 116th Evacuation Hospital, which was part of the Rainbow Division. So they went in after everybody because they didn't have guns. Well, the other thing that's really crazy is that part of the war policies, Geneva Convention, whatever, the Nazis, if they flew over a tent, and I'm going to call it a plastic tent. I don't really know that it was a plastic tent, but it was a movable tent. They could put it up, take it down. If there was a Red Cross, like American Red Cross, the Nazis were not supposed to bomb it. Well, do you think they paid attention to that? No. So what happened was at night, they had to use flashlights to operate. Because if they had that big fancy light showing, it was going to give a clue to the Nazis that maybe it was an operating room. But if they just saw flashlights, they might think, oh, it's a soldier reading or something, you know, reading a letter, reading a book, whatever. So the other thing is, can you imagine having surgery when somebody's using a flashlight? And I'm assuming it was maybe the surgical tech or a nurse or maybe a soldier that was using a flashlight to show the surgeon where to go. So when I learned about that, it just boggled my mind. Okay, let's see, is that it about Battle of the Bulge and operating rooms? Yes. Okay, so I know that you know this, but I'm just gonna kind of give you a reference point. A reminder, the Holocaust was the systemic state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its allies and collaborators. Anti-Semitism was the core ideology of the Holocaust and a basic target of Nazi ideology, along with becoming widespread across Europe. Well, when I talk more about Dachau, and when you think about the whole Holocaust, there were many more people, at least probably 6 million more people, who died because they somehow didn't fit with Adolf Hitler's ideology of the Aryan race. They could have been a different nationality, they could have been political prisoners, they could have been academics, they could have been artists, they could have been all sorts of other things that Hitler thought was terrible. Okay, and part of why I feel really committed to working on this and talking about this is that I'm sure you've read that anti-Semitism is on the rise. There's Holocaust denial, there's hoax. One of the times I was talking to 8th graders. I mean 8th graders, they're what, 12, 13 years old. And the student said, well, I heard that it was a hoax. And I heard that the Jews caused the Holocaust. And I'm like, so I said a quick prayer and I said, okay, help me God. Help me answer this without, yelling at the kid, which I didn't, I want you to know. And so I feel it's really important, and one of the slides you'll see part of why I'm talking about what I'm talking about. Okay, here we go. This is the pyramid of hate, and the pyramid of hate is, I think, very profound, and if you want to see it, go to the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., or just Google Pyramid of Hate. So some of you from psychology in high school or college may have heard about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but this is the Pyramid of Hate. So the first level is, can you hear me in the back, Ginger? Okay. Biased attitudes. Well, that's in our thought process. Okay, I'm better than that person, so I'm not gonna like them. Or I don't like the way they dress, and in my head, I may not say anything, but I'm gonna stay away from them. I don't wanna have lunch with them at the table. It's our thought process of something that we deem less important, less valuable, less meaningful, whatever words we wanna put to it. It may not be verbal, but it's in our mind and in our thoughts, and oftentimes that impacts our action, our decisions. Then we have acts of bias. Okay, I'm sorry, biased attitudes. That's stereotyping. All people of this whatever are bad people. Insensitive remarks, like that person is you call them a name. We don't like people who are different than we are. Microaggression, judging people by we judge based on seeking out people of like-mindedness. Okay, we all go to the same whatever. And then beginning to believe in negative kinds of information as truth. Like this young man who said to me that the Holocaust was a myth or a hoax. Okay. Then we have acts of bias, and that can be bullying, it can be ridicule, name-calling, epithets, social avoidance, dehumanization, bias, belittling jokes. And this is one of the things, so I don't think this was an issue when we were all in school. Maybe it was, but the schools have had a lot of work about bullying and how not to bully and what have you, and kids get really upset, and there's the whole social media bullying and what have you. So an example of that It was the targeted groups in addition to the Jews that were part of the Holocaust. So we had people with disabilities. We had the Roma and Sinti, who are the gypsies. And growing up, I don't know about other places, but I know in Spokane we had gypsies. I remember working at Penny's and having gypsy people come in, and I helped them with whatever they were getting. Members of clergy. There were over 3,000 Catholic priests at Dachau. Over 2,000 of them were murdered. And they were all absolutely humiliated and made to do really obviously bad things, and I'm just not gonna tell you what they were. Black people, there were a number of people in Germany that maybe had a black parent and a German spouse. Gays, Poles, and other Slavic people, because Hitler didn't like people from Lithuania, Latvia, Luxembourg. There were Soviet POWs, and back then, the Soviets were an ally. They weren't part of the Axis. And then somebody who had committed a crime, what have you. And the other thing that I found really interesting was there was royalty there. So like princes and princesses and kings and queens, particularly of smaller countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg. There were some from Holland. I don't know all the countries, but can you imagine having lived a life of royalty and then ending up in a place like Dachau concentration camp when you had to sleep with 3 other people on top of you type of thing? So those were just some of the targeted groups. Okay, then we have the pyramid of hate. That's discrimination. That's economic discrimination. It's political discrimination, education. You may know about how people who were Jewish, their businesses were taken away from them, their houses were taken away, their possessions were taken away, they lost their job, they had to live on the street. It was just, they didn't know how to earn any money anymore. Shops were destroyed. Okay, so here's, So here's a little bit of information about the escalation of anti-Semitic Nazi policy. And I share this with you because it's like the pyramid of hate. It sort of sneaks up on you. You know, things start happening and then they get a little worse and a little worse and a little worse. And we kind of don't necessarily notice it until it gets really bad. So in 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. That was a long time before the United States entered World War II in 1941 after Pearl Harbor. So I could talk also about the United States and their response and what have you, but I'm not going to talk about that. But there's some really interesting books about that and about FDR's cabinet. February 27th, the Reichstag was the building, the headquarters for Hitler and the Nazis. There was a fire, and he suspended civil liberties over the alleged communist threat. So he didn't want anything to do with communism. April 1st, 1933, there were the anti-Jewish boycotts. So if you had any connection with being Jewish, things were boycotted. And you all probably know about the Jewish people having to wear the yellow star. So they had to be identified, and they had to wear the yellow star in a location on their coat, their shirt, their dress, you know, what have you. Okay, then May 10th, 1933, were the first book burnings. And that was where Hitler was against intellectualism. He was against anything that did not agree with his ideology. Then on August 19th, 1934, he declared himself Führer. Then in September 15th of 1935, that was the Nuremberg race laws that were enacted and then continued throughout World War II. So then we have level 4, that's bias-motivated violence. Those are things like murder, rape, assault, arson, terrorism, vandalism, total desecration of synagogues, Jewish businesses, anything that was related to the groups of people, particularly Jewish people, that were against Hitler's ideology. and then, of course, threats. So an example is Kristallnacht. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of this, but Kristallnacht was November 9th, 1938, and it means Night of Broken Glass. And this is when the Nazis came into Germany and Austria, and you can see they broke the windows in shopkeepers' businesses, synagogues, people's houses. They completely destroyed anything that was related to being Jewish. And of course, it caused great fear and anxiety. And people lost their business, they lost their possessions, they lost their home, they lost their lives, and there was broken glass everywhere. So that was November 9th, 1938, November 9th to November 10th, 1938. So I keep forgetting to ask this, but I think what I'm about to tell you is a coincidence. But on November 9th, 1989, does anybody remember what happened? Ronald Reagan. That was when Ronald Reagan said, tear down the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall came down on November 9th, 1938. I have no clue if it was intentional. I'm guessing it was coincidental. But I keep forgetting to ask somebody. If there's a historian in here, let me know. Tomorrow I'm going to meet with some friends who are history professors at Whitworth, and I'll ask him. But anyway, it's a significant date. Okay, then we have the level 5, which is the worst, and that's genocide. And that is the intent to deliberately and systematically annihilate an entire people. And the systematic aspect of it, part of it, was sending people to concentration camps, enclosing them in, not feeding them, not giving medical care, putting them in a situation where they could be subjected to typhus, typhoid, tuberculosis. They were physically, emotionally, you name it, abused, treated badly. And then many of them, up to like 16 million and more, that nobody's going to ever really know the exact number, were murdered. So I want to say that I have the honor of being in 2 Holocaust museums. And there's a number of people who are Holocaust survivors. And I think being in Spokane, you know about Carla Pepperzak and the fact that there's a middle school on 58th or 59th that's named after her. She's now 102. I've had the privilege of knowing her, and the first time I spoke, she spoke, then I spoke. And I was like, oh, wow, how am I going to speak after her? But I did. I kind of stumbled through. And an amazing woman, and I'm going to have somebody mention something about her tonight. So the final solution was the persecution of Jews evolved in it increasing radical violence between 1933 and 1945. Now remember, we didn't really know what was going on for sure until the 1940s. When Pearl Harbor happened, December 7th, 1941, that's when we declared war. And in many of my dad's letters and in the 85 books I've read, the soldiers, when they got to the concentration camps, really did not know what they were coming up to. And so part of it was like, oh, we're going to go fight the Nazis and what have you. And then they saw what they saw. And General Eisenhower, who then became President Eisenhower, when he first saw the camp at Ordef, he realized that people were not going to believe what happened. They were going to try and pretend it didn't happen. So in his brilliance, he commissioned 400 photographers to go to all the different camps and take pictures, and then made copies of the pictures, gave them to the soldiers so that when they went home, they could say, this is what we saw. This is what we were fighting against. And in so many of the books and things that I've studied, they would say, I had no idea until I walked into one of those concentration camps what was really happening. And it was just a total shock. Okay, so Nazi Germany and its allies, collaborators, killed almost 2/3 of European Jews through deadly living conditions, brutal mistreatment, mass shootings and gassings, specially designed killing centers such as death camps like Auschwitz is probably one of the more well-known death camps. And Joseph Mengele, who was a horrible, awful person, there were lines and it was like, you go this way, you go this way. Well, if they went this way, they went to the gas chamber right away. And usually that was the women, the elderly, the children. And if they were young men that seemed fairly sturdy, then they went to the work camps. And then they were worked to death or starved to death. Okay. So, Dachau. Now, to be honest with you, I don't really remember studying much in high school about the Holocaust. And it's very possible that it was kind of too soon after, it was like within a few years after the war ended. So there were over 44,000. The other thing I learned in doing all of this, which just totally surprised me, is there were concentration camps in Northern Africa. Now, some of you, and I remember studying about the desert fox, Rommel, and he was in Northern Africa. But Dachau was 18 miles from Munich. And it was near Austria. And so, I'm sorry, I need to go back here. Okay, so can you see Belgium up there in the yellow? Okay, so my dad and his people went from Belgium in the Battle of the Bulge, exhausted, down to Dachau, and they had no clue really what they were coming to. So, and then you can see how close they were to Switzerland and Austria. Okay, so Heinrich Himmler, he was what they called the architect of the final solution, and he established Dachau. He was the architect of all the concentration camps. So Dachau was the premier role model, so to speak, of the concentration camps. So then Nazi guards from the other camps were going to come, and Theodor Eicke, who was the commandant, created a school of violence. Well, now, how nice was that? Not very. So the Nazi guards would come and they would learn how to be violent and learn how to be horrible, horrible, horrible people and train them, and then the Nazi guards would go back to whatever camp that they were part of. 44,000, that's a whole lot of concentration camps. And so Dachau really was the role model of the Nazi concentration camps. Okay, so here we have Dachau, and I'm going to focus more about Dachau. So I'm sorry, I'm getting carried away here. Okay, so let me read to you one of his letters. And I'm going to actually read you the letter rather than tell you the letter because I want you to hear his words. He said, "Please, darling, don't feel you have to rant on paper about Dachau. I know you see it and know it for what it is, and that's all I care about. All I ask is that you instill it into as many thousands as you can till we can get millions to see it and never forget the name of Dachau." And so when I found the letters, multiple times it was, I want you to tell thousands so that millions will know what Dachau is and never forget the name of Dachau. And because my father could not talk about it during his life, he never said a word to any of us. Well, I should say my siblings. I know that my mom knew about it because she got these horrible letters. But that's why I feel partly so committed to doing what I'm doing, to tell thousands. I'm not up to millions. I think I might have gotten to thousands, but I don't know that I'll ever make it to millions. But I know that I want to get to as many people as I can to help them to see, oh my gosh. And for whatever reason, Auschwitz seems to be very well known. Dachau, not as much, which is okay. It's just that I want people to know. Okay, so it was the first camp. It opened March 22nd, 1933. Now, that was 8 years before we got into World War II. And that was Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Did I say 42? I meant 41. Okay. And then initially, it was to imprison political opponents, anybody who was against Hitler. So one of the things that he would say is the Germans fear Dachau, and they had a jingle. Dear God, make me silent that I may not come to Dachau. So even the Germans had heard about the horrible things that were happening at Dachau. Now, Dachau was a town 18 miles from Munich. And it was its own little town, and it was very well known for its lighting. So lots of artists, painters, what have you, would come to Dachau at certain times of the year because of the lighting, which would help them draw or paint or whatever it was, the pictures that they had. Well, in some of the letters and some of the things I've read, it was like the people of Dachau, oh no, we didn't know it happened, oh no. Well, I'm here to tell you that the Nazi guards had to have gone into the town of Dachau, which was right next to the fence of Dachau, to get their beer, their cheese, their toothpaste, what have you. To be gross, they had to smell what was being smelled. They had to see ashes coming out of chimneys. So they had to be really dense, naive, and I mean, I just don't have the bad words to put there. So for those of us who remember Mrs. Hutchison, she didn't give me enough bad words to talk about the Holocaust. Okay, so Dachau comprised of 140 subcamps. Now this may be a surprise. Auschwitz, its subcamp, one of its subcamps was Birkenau. There were numbers and numbers of subcamps. Two of the subcamps of Dachau, Kaffering 1 and Kaffering 2. And so I don't know all the 140. They were there to work slave labor. And as you can see, they were working in inhumane conditions. You can see their clothing. You can see this bad truck that they had to use. And I want to tell you that back then, there were some companies that really, really benefited because the Nazis, quote unquote, sold the prisoners to the companies to do slave labor. So IG Farben, you may have heard of gas chambers, and Cyclone B, that they were the company that made Cyclone B, that was the gas that killed people. Bear, as in Bear aspirin, so how many of us either had Bear aspirin when we had a temperature or gave it to our children or our grandchildren when they had a fever? AGFA is it's a manufacturing diesel kind of a company. BMW, the car. And they all made millions of dollars out of the slave labor. Now, one of the things that I don't know if this is a great example, but my understanding is that they maybe had up to 500 calories to live off of. So when I talk to students, some of us may be more knowledgeable about calories, but I've said to them, okay, you may have had a Big Mac or what's the other one? A Whopper. Okay, they are about 500, 550 calories. So that means that's all they had, was that amount, or an apple, or grass that was boiled in water that they got out of the ground because it was growing. So certainly it wasn't very good. And then they had something called coffee, which was, I think, water and dirt. I'm not sure exactly. So it was not nutritious at all. Okay, so okay, I want to read this letter, and it's a compilation of several letters that I put together. And he writes to his wife, "We are in the nightmarish Holocaust," he wrote on March 25th, 1945, so just a couple weeks ago. The 116th evac hospital moved across France and Germany behind the advancing lines. Gosh, darling, a guy just wonders how many more times the world is going to ask for the Holocaust messes to be gone through. Each one seems like the last straw, and yet more and more come. Then 2 days later, on March 28th, Holocaust after Holocaust is just wearing me out. On April 20th, 1945, as the 116th approaches Dachau and rumors circulate about what might be found there, he wrote, "We are the only evac hospital within 100 miles of this horrible, horrible Holocaust." 6 days after that, we at least had wee hopes of not stepping right up into another Holocaust. But preliminary reports at least indicate it might well be that nightmarish Holocaust all over again from this next site. So I want to give you, a friend of my brother's was a journalist, and he called me one day. He lived in Michigan and said that he had gotten a contract or whatever for Time magazine to write a story about my dad, and he wanted to come to Eugene and read the letters. Now, of course, I haven't told you how I found the letters yet, but that's the surprise, or one of the surprises. And so he contacted a professor at Duke University in North Carolina. Now, I didn't talk to the professor, so I can't say 150% it was true, but I don't know why Steve would have lied and told me this happened when it didn't happen. The professor said, did her father read a lot? And I go, well, yeah, he read sports magazines and the sports paper and science. And the professor said, well, did he ever read Nathaniel Hawthorne? And I'm like, I don't know, I suppose. I mean, the Scarlet Letter. Well, evidently, according to this professor, my dad used the term Holocaust before it came in common usage. And evidently, in the Scarlet Letter, Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote something about the Holocaust, which stands for fire. And so maybe my dad, that's where he kept coming up with the word Holocaust. I have no idea. One of these days, I'll try and see if I can find that professor, but I don't know about you, but my list of to-dos is very long. Okay, so as they approached Dachau, it was even more shocking. There were dozens of cattle cars filled with dead and barely living bodies. The smell was so bad that many vomited or fainted. Now, there's a couple movies that I would encourage you to watch. They're not happy movies, but one is called Lee, L-E-E, by, she was in the Titanic. Anyway, she was the producer, and she was a photographer at Dachau. And so some of the film there, I was like, oh my gosh, that could have been where my dad was, or that. I mean, it just really struck me. And of course, it may not strike you that way because it wasn't your dad. But anyway, but they really didn't know what they were coming into. And one of my friends, actually, she's a Spokane person, her father was a medic, and he was about to go into Dachau, and some soldiers that were in Dachau said to him, don't go in there. Whatever you do, don't go in there. Because when they first went in there, they had no idea what they were going to find. And it was just awful. So the soldiers had a really hard time. And then I also learned, I was in South Carolina 2 weeks ago, and the teacher, one of the teachers, his father-in-law was in the Rainbow Division, and his wife was at the talk, and they said that the soldiers had to draw cards to see who was going to go in there because there were too many people in the Rainbow Division. Well, at the time, I'm sure that the soldiers didn't really know what they were going in. Figuratively, minutes after its liberation, while 40,000 wrecks of humanity milled, tore, looted, screamed like depraved beasts, which the Nazi SS had made them. In those early minutes, I saw captured SS against a wall and then shot in what you Americans would call cold blood. But Emily, God forgive me if I saw it without a single disturbed emotion. And then in big, bold, scrolling over and over, of course they didn't have fonts back then, because they so had it coming to them after what I had just seen and what every minute more I have been seeing of the SS action. As they burst through the concentration camp, the survivors saw the soldiers and started yelling, "Americans, Americans!" There was incredible joy for those who could stand. My father described how survivors covered with lice and filth would hug him and he'd hug back. When I read this, it really touched me because my dad, being a surgeon, being an anesthesiologist, was very hygienic. And even, this is funny, and of course we didn't understand it at the time, but before dinner, he would stand at the kitchen sink and scrub for dinner, you know, like you'd see in a medical show. And we go, "Oh, come on, Dad, hurry up." Well, he even scrubbed for dinner in my mother's clean house, you know? So to be there and to hug back people who were covered with lice, it really touched me. Not that my dad was a mean person, it was just he was very hygienic. And he knew how important it was to be clean. So that really touched me. Okay, so here we are, April 29th, 1945. So today's the 14th, so in literally 15 days is the liberation, which will be the 81st liberation. There were close to 68,000 prisoners. Now, he said 40,000. He wasn't counting. But allegedly, from all the history we've learned, there were like 68,000. Some died soon after. Some died while they were there. Some were so, again, we go back to the compassionate passing, is they had to determine who was going to be able to handle anesthesia, surgery. And penicillin was fairly new then. And there was a man from Holland who was the best friend, confidant, senior official to Prince Bernhard of Holland. And when Dad met him, he was what they called a capo, which were prisoners that were sort of the chief of police of all the other prisoners. And so he gave Hans little bits of penicillin. And then later, after the war, my dad went to Holland to meet the prince and Hans. And every Christmas, we didn't know what it was all about, but we knew that our dad around Christmas was talking to somebody in Holland. Well, this was Hans. We finally figured out what it was, but he wouldn't talk about it. So on the right, I just love this picture on the right because they're raising the American flag and they're taking down the Nazi flag. And you can imagine the jubilation. Now, obviously, these are the people who were still strong enough to stand. We're not showing you the pictures of people who were laying on the ground and who couldn't stand. But it really was mayhem. And I'll tell you, how am I doing on time? I'm losing track. Anybody? Am I doing okay? 5 minutes? Okay. Whoops, I better hurry up. Okay. Okay, here's the gate to Dachau. Arbeit macht frei, that's German. Work will set you free. Now, in Auschwitz, they had the same door, and the Jewish people turned the V upside down and backwards, and the Nazis never noticed it. Okay. And so it was kind of like, you know, that was their little bit of civil disobedience. What? Oh, there we go. Okay, when I first saw this, I was just like, what? So this is a document that says Captain David Wilsey is a permanent resident of Dachau concentration camp. And I was absolutely floored when I saw that. But then it took me a while to realize that he had to prove who he was, so that as he was moving around, if somebody stopped him, he could say, here, you know, I'm legitimate. Okay. So I finally figured that one out, but at first it made me really sick to my stomach. So when my dad sent the letters, they went from Dachau, Battle of the Bulge, over 4,700 miles to Bismarck, North Dakota, where my mother was living with their infant son. And then here's another example of a letter. Emily, we are sweating, stinking, existing in the hell on earth, Dachau. Let every word of January Reader's Digest bore through the middle of your guts and multiply 1,000-fold. The atrocity reports are true and more. For over 8 days, I've seen, lived, smelled, existed as one of 27 doctors to try to correct the medical horror component of the hell on earth. Bodies starved to 50 pounds, men piled like rotting cordwood, huge gas chambers built like shower rooms, a roof, hangman scaffolds, cremating ovens for dead, dying, conscious skin and bone wrecks of humanity, stepping high as you walk to work over dead bodies in the streets, stormtroopers, the SS, riot prisoners, and man-eating Doberman pinchers, all rotting. And the reason they were there, they couldn't clean things up because they were waiting for Eisenhower, Patton, ambassadors to come and see the atrocities. And so they had to, like you see in a crime show, the crime scene, the yellow thing, do not go past. So that was it. Okay. So the letters would start like somewhere in Germany, somewhere else in Germany, somewhere else again in Germany, somewhere in France, somewhere in Belgium. These are the words my father used to start the letters to his wife. And that was because they didn't want the Nazis to find the letters and figure out where they were. So the letters went from Belgium, Dachau, to Bismarck. Most of the soldiers' letters were censored, either blackened or cut out. My dad had one letter cut out. Now, was that because he was a doctor? Was that, who knows why? But I think it was God. God wanted those letters saved. And they wanted those letters to be hidden in the back of our attic in spite of a fire. They lived through a fire when I was in the 7th grade. And those letters were buried in the back of the attic, covered with dust, and they were a little smoky, but they were there. Okay. Here's another one. I flood you with latrine rumors just because we get flooded with latrine rumors. I believe the rumor will materialize that they burned Dachau to the ground. It's funny, but we all just sort of hopefully wait with fiendish glee for that moment to see this place roaring in flames. Maybe we're sort of like Nero, huh? However, besides performing an ignominious end, justified, it would consume the typhus within it. To give you an idea, it would be like burning Bismarck, yet residential Bismarck would be left to live in for us, our patients. So maybe the sword will be turned. An old quotation, you enter the door, at Dachau you enter by the door and leave by the chimney. Instead of its hundreds of thousands of people, hooray, hooray, it will be gone, gone, gone. Okay. My dad was very creative in his writing. Like I say, there weren't fonts, there weren't whatever. So he would write like a big capital D, and then with a bracket, he'd write words like dastardly, deplorable, dismal, dirty, diseased, disgusting. Those were to emphasize the horror of what he was experiencing. Okay, here's the typhus word. You see the red arrow and the man with the mask, that was my dad. He's the only one there with a mask on, which kind of indicates his cleanliness idea. But this is where all the people with the typhus ward were. The man crouching by the cot, this was an incredible story, but his son is a professor at the University of Oregon, and Jerry and I, quote unquote, accidentally met, and I had pictures of his dad and my dad standing next to each other in 3 pictures. And it was an emotional earthquake for Jerry and me to realize that both of our fathers were there and in this picture. And this picture is on the website of the World War II Museum in New Orleans. Okay, I'll skip over that. So this is one of the emotional earthquakes. So in 2006, I was at a conference in Washington, D.C., and I had time to wait until some friends were going to pick me up. And so I heard people talking about the Holocaust Museum. And mind you, I didn't really know much, anything really. So I went there, and there were 3 elevators, and this one line had like 50 people, and then there was the middle elevator where I stood, because I wanted to be at the front of the line. And the man over here said, oh, do you want to get in the front of the line? I said, oh, sure. I mean, that doesn't happen. We go, and this is the truth. We go to the third floor, the doors open up from the elevator, and on the wall across from the elevator is a film with my dad walking past two former prisoners in his military uniform, and they are in that striped outfit that the prisoners had to wear. Well, I just was blown away, and at first I was like, no, that's not my dad. It is, it's not, it is, you know. And then I called my mom, and I said, Mom, and I ended up having to tell her 5 times. She never said a word. I finally said, Mom, say something. She said, oh, that's interesting. And the next few times I'd be in Spokane, I would tell anybody that would listen, and they would say, oh, Emily, so what do you think about that? And she'd go, oh, that's interesting. She never, ever, ever said a word. So I'm just thinking that she got these horrible letters, so she had to have been traumatized by these letters, and she had an infant son that was very ill, and she didn't want to talk about it either. So I think they had a vow of secrecy or something. Okay, so here's what the letters looked like. And they were actually in better condition. This was after I'd gone through them. They were in pristine chronological condition. And again, buried in the back of the attic, and they lived through a fire when I was in the 7th grade. So to me, this is a God thing. They were supposed to exist, and they're supposed to be shared with people. And they are now archived at the Holocaust Center for Humanity in Seattle. Okay, I'm going to skip over that. Okay. So you may have heard the poem by D. Muller. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. So the last letter that my father wrote that I read was, "Darling, don't be mad at me, but I had an opportunity to go home, but there were too many people laying in hallways in need of anesthesia and surgery that they desperately needed." So he could have gone home to his wife and his infant son, but he stayed there, and he could have died, and if he died, guess what? I wouldn't be here. So his belief in God, in the Hippocratic Oath, caused him to stay there and do whatever he could to mitigate the horrors that the Nazis had perpetrated on them. So I want to share something with you. Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't read this. One of the things he said in the letter, he said, "Look for me in a newsreel. To think that this is the only Queen Bee camp, it is here that policies were worked out." Well, that picture at the museum was that newsreel. Okay, so Yom HaShoah is commemoration, memory of the Jewish people that were murdered in all of the concentration camps. It started at sunset last night, it ends at sunset tonight. Yom HaShoah the word Shoah is for fire, and it's to recognize all of those who died and were murdered. On January 27th, 1945, on January 27th, it's International Holocaust Remembrance Day that was declared by the United Nations in 2005, and that's for everybody who died. But tonight, I want to read you a prayer about Yom HaShoah, and then I'm going to ask somebody from Temple Beth Shalom to talk a minute about something that's happening tonight. So this is a prayer written by Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs. It's a prayer for Yom HaShoah. Today on Yom HaShoah, we remember the victims of the greatest crime of man against man, the young, the old, the innocent, the 1.5 million children, starved, shot, given lethal injections, gassed, burned, and turned to ash because they were deemed guilty of the crime of being different. We remember what happens when hate takes hold of the human heart and turns it into stone, what happens when victims cry for help and there is no one listening. What happens when humanity fails to recognize that those who are not in our image are nonetheless in God's image. Remember and pay tribute to the survivors who bore witness to what happened and to the victims so that who were robbed of their lives, they would not be robbed also of their deaths. We remember and give thanks for the righteous of the nations who saved lives, often at risk of their own, teaching us how in the darkest night we can light a candle of hope. Today on Yom HaShoah, we call on you, Almighty God, to help us hear your voice that says in every generation, do not murder. Do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. Do not oppose the stranger. We know that while we do not have the ability to change the past, we can change the future. We know that while we cannot bring the dead back to life, we can ensure that memories live on and that their deaths were not in vain. And so on this Yom HaShoah, we commit ourselves to one simple act, Yizkor, remember. May the souls of the victims be bound in the bond of everlasting life. Amen. So Bud from Temple Beth Shalom, I'd like you to talk about tonight.
First of all, as a retired Holocaust educator, thank you for what you do. It's amazing. Tonight at Temple Beth Shalom, Yom HaShoah, you can hear Carla's story, part of Carla's story. She'll be interviewed, present part of her story. There will be an art exhibit there too. Students come around the art area. Amazing art that produced middle school, high school students, inspired by stories of resistance and their interpretation. Just wonderful art that you can see. Some of the students will be there to talk about their art as well, which makes it even more powerful. So they can talk about how these stories impacted them. Carla's story is one of those, and some of that art is that. It is open to the public, starts at 7 o'clock tonight, and everyone is welcome. Location, Temple Beth Shalom. Herschel, what's the address? I always say 30th and Perry. 30th and Perry, just to the west of Perry. So everybody's welcome. Phenomenal observation. Remembrance goes on. Herschel, anything else tonight that you'd like to express? Herschel is one that is instrumental in keeping Yom HaShoah going.
I will say that many places honor Yom HaShoah by reading the names of people who perished. And in Israel, at 10 o'clock Israel time, there's a siren that is blown, and people, wherever they are, in a car, in a store, they go out of their car, they go out of the store, and they stand for 2 minutes to honor the people who perished in Yom HaShoah.
Anything else that you'd like to add?
Not only are you invited to come tonight, you're requested to come tonight. This observance is for the community of Spokane. It's not just for the Jewish community. At 10 o'clock this morning in Israel, when that siren sounded, my son was coming out of Hadassah Hospital after an appointment, and he said it's amazing. Everybody, just like you said, things stop, people get out of their cars, they bow their head in silence for the 2 minutes that siren is sounding.
So I would encourage you sometime today, spend 2 minutes thinking about all those people who perished. And think about ways that you can ways that you can help educate people about the Holocaust and how we can prevent something like that happening again. So thank you.
Although she did one commercial, I'll do another one. Her book, Letters from Duchau. please buy her book. No, she doesn't want you to get it from Amazon.
No, in fact, yesterday, I have to tell you, this is really cool. I went to Auntie's to just say, you know, blah, 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 and to tell them that people might call them. And even though there's a company that you all know that starts with an A, I would encourage you to go to a place like Auntie's and patronize a local bookstore. And it turns out I met somebody there whose great-grandmother survived Birkenau, which was the subcamp of Auschwitz. So I'm not going to say who he was or anything because he didn't give me permission. I should probably not even say that. But it's another God thing, you know, to actually meet somebody at Auntie's. And so I don't promote my book because it's not a book-selling thing. But, I mean, I'm not into selling books, but it's a way to get the word out, to get thousands to know about Dachau.
Well, it's a great book. I want to thank you all for coming.
So are there any questions? Do we have time?
I think we need to go.
Okay.
You can stick around.
Okay. I can stick around
If you have, yeah, if
questions.
you have questions, stick around and she'll be available. Thank you all.
What time is it, by the way?
I don't know. I never wear a watch.
Okay.